Hello, I'm Megan Quigley, and welcome to the Westward Movement. In our presentation, we will be exploring the transition from life in urban environments to the unknown lands of the West and the conflicts of the Indians they faced there. Once the Civil War came to a close, farmers, former slaves, and other workers decided to start fresh in a new land. During the 19th century, farmland was increasingly expensive for African Americans and immigrants. Ethnic and religious oppression caused these minorities to pack up the belongings they could carry and seek freedom in the West. This uninhabited land also attracted criminals who were running from the law. In an attempt to attract the remote western land, the government issued the Pacific Railroad Acts in 1862 and 1864. These acts granted the railroad companies 10 miles of land for every mile of track constructed. Gained land was sold by the railroad companies to incoming settlers. The companies profited from the selling of the land, and farmers gained more land and resources. The railroad provided a way to bring settlers and manufactured goods west and ship their agricultural and mining products east. The Transcontinental Railroad was an essential source for rapid development of the frontier. Lewis M. Clement was the engineer in charge of the location, design, and construction of the Central Pacific Railroad, by far the most difficult section of the Pacific Railroad. Clement said,
"Against these utterances from men of railroad experience, the company had to battle in financial circles, forcing them to show that they were not attempting an impossibility, though always realizing the great difficulties."
What really persuaded Americans to make the journey westward was the Homestead Act. Lincoln, who signed the act, remarked in 1861,
"I think it worthy of consideration, and that the wild lands of the country should be distributed so that every man should have the means and opportunity of benefiting his condition."
The Homestead Act encouraged Western migration by providing settlers 160 acres of public land. In exchange, homesteaders paid a small filing fee and were required to complete 5 years of continuous residence before receiving ownership of the land. After 6 months of residency, homesteaders also had the option of purchasing the land from the government for $1.25 per acre. However, in order to purchase this land, people had to meet certain requirements and conditions. Dreamers in the hopes of moving west for a better life had to be at least 21 years old, citizens of America, or immigrants in the midst of filing for citizenship, and had to agree to build a house of a minimum size. The Homestead Act granted settlers over 80 million acres of land by 1900. Many people were not brave enough to take the journey west. Laura Ingalls Wilder observed,
"Pa did not like a country so old and worn out that the hunting was poor. He wanted to go west. For 2 years he had wanted to go west and take a homestead, but Ma did not want to leave the settled country."
Congress granted the state governments millions of acres of westward land that the state was then allowed to sell. The Memorial Land Grant Act raised money for the creation of colleges that specialized in agriculture. Land speculators and bankers purchased the land in hopes that it would bring profit in years to come. The West saw remarkable population growth in the 1870s and 1880s, though this growth was by no means evenly spread across the western lands. Though we often think of the West as a large homogeneous region, in reality it was as diverse in history, culture, and development as the eastern half of the United States. Foreign-born immigrants accounted for half the settlers in the West, making it a remarkably diverse group. As the settlers moved west into the frontier, they altered the way of life for the Indians, and as conflict rose, battles broke out and the government tried to suppress the Indians' way of life. The Indians were the original settlers of the Great Plains and had a natural right to their way of life. Long before the settlers arrived, the Indians lived simply off the land as farmers, hunters, and gatherers. Their method of obtaining food determined the way of life in which they lived. Hunting was the dominant occupation, with buffalo as the most viable source. They provided the Indians with meat, shelter, clothing, and trade. The hides were especially valuable as they could be used to build teepees and to make clothing. Tribes often used the resources from buffalo to trade other tribes for items that they needed. Hunters would trade farmers for corn and other crops they did not produce themselves.
Native Americans, the main way that they obtained all the goods that they needed for their everyday life was through trade. The hunters were able to capture a valuable buffalo, which they could then trade for their meat and their hides, while the farmers would gather crops, which were necessary for sustainable living and nourishment.
As the men went out to farm and hunt, the women cared for the children and gathered foods such as berries. Their role was especially important in nomadic tribes that moved from place to place. Because of their temporary lifestyle, it was important for the tribes to have women's contributions in case their hunt was unsuccessful. Nothing was ever guaranteed in the nomadic way of life. In the lives of tribal Indians, there was consistency in their customs and sacred traditions. Indians were very religious, and their practices were mainly spiritual and moral. Indians had a deep-rooted moral system that they lived by, and they believed that since everything was given to them by God, it was meant to be shared by all. Because the Indians had such deep spiritual and moral beliefs regarding their land, when settlers came and claimed and developed the land, it caused conflict. The settlers wanted the land for farming, ranching, and mining, all of which would grant financial benefit. This greed was very foreign to the Indians' moral way of life. The settlers believed that uncultivated and land without permanent homes was wasted. Because of this, settlers sought to take advantage of the land and all the benefits they could receive. Some Indians were nomads, people who traveled from place to place, usually following available food sources, instead of living in one location. After the Americans discovered the value of the Western land, the government tried to restrict the movement of these nomadic people by negotiating treaties. Some treaties offered the federal purchase of Indian land, often for little in return. The native people did not agree with the selling of the Western land. Chief Crazy Horse said,
"One does not sell the land people walk on."
Other treaties restricted Indians to reservations, pieces of federal land set aside for them. These treaties often caused misunderstandings and fraud. The government continued its practice of putting groups of Indians together who often had no relation to each other at all. The government designated chiefs or leaders to sign the treaty. However, these chiefs often did not represent the majority of the people. In order to ensure the treaties were signed, the government bribed the chiefs and sometimes dealt violently with the tribes until the Indians agreed. The chiefs often did not know the treaties were restricting them to reservations or that they would be in danger. The Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, helped ensure that critical supplies was delivered to the reservations. However, corruption among the BIA's agents led to supplies being mishandled and stolen. The government did its best to protect the reservations, but settlers stole land, killed buffalo, diverted water supplies, and attacked Indian camps.
The land is sacred. These words are at the core of your being. The land is our mother. The rivers our blood. Take away our land and we die. That is, the Indian in us dies. Mary Brave Bird, Lakota Tribe.
The Native Americans reacted to these treaties with anger, and soon acts of violence from both sides began to erupt. The government finally came to the realization that the treaties were useless, and in 1871 decided to make no more treaties and recognize no more chiefs. Both sides lacked a strategy and resources to make one. They reacted to each other's attacks in long, bloody battles. The Indians were outnumbered and had many more casualties. However, the majority of their deaths stemmed from disease and lack of food and shelter. The American army was spread throughout the South monitoring Reconstruction and had little resources to send to the West. The government made a formal request for all Civil War veterans to help control and relocate the Native Americans onto designated reservations.
American soldiers were paid $13 a month, given an old Civil War uniform, and expected to build forts, drive settlers from reservations, and protect miners, railroad builders, and politicians, while occasionally fighting Native Americans. However, after a long, hard Civil War, few soldiers wanted to return to battle, and therefore there was a lack of response for assembling an army.
As the army moved west, confrontation and conflict emerged with the Native Americans. The Native Americans, being spiritual and peaceful people, did not want altercation and often cooperated with government's requests to relocate. such as in the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. In this event, Colorado's governor requested the Native Americans relocate to Sand Creek, where they would be protected. However, upon arrival, contrary to the promise for protection, the Army killed between 400 and 500 people, mainly women and children. Upon Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle's death, he sung out,
"Nothing lives long, only the earth and the mountains."
While the Indians strove to maintain peace, they were not afraid to defend the right to their land. As the Sioux chief said upon Army invasion of the Black Hills and Bighorn Mountains,
"We must protect the forest for our children, grandchildren, and children yet to be born. We must protect the forest for those who can't speak for themselves, such as the birds, animals, fish, and trees."
In the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, the Sioux tribe defended their land after refusing to sell it to the government for plans of building a road through the Bighorn Mountains and mining gold rumored that the Black Hills cradled from the grassroots down. Also referred to as the Custard's Last Stand, since Colonel George A. Custer led the army to round up the Indians and, surprised by their large numbers, was killed along with 200 of his soldiers. Under stress for half a century, Native Americans saw the rise of religious prophets predicting danger. In order to avoid this danger, a prophet of the plains called Vovaka promised a return to traditional life if people performed purification ceremonies such as the ghost dance. This dance was a ritual in which the Indians joined hands and whirled in a circle. Not understanding the Indians' religious practices, the government took them as a threat and ordered that Sitting Bull, the leader of the Teton Sioux who performed the ghost dance, be arrested. In pursuit of him, soldiers opened fire, killing him along with more than 200 Sioux. This massacre occurred in 1890 and is referred to as the Battle of Wounded Knee. After the massacre at Wounded Knee, new policies toward Native Americans were put into effect. The life of an Indian who was no longer to be free, roaming along the vast plains and practicing their traditional customs. The Indians were obviously opposed to these new customs, but surprisingly, there were some white Americans that were horrified by the way the Indians were treated.
In Helen Hunt Jackson's 1881 publication of A Nation of Dishonor, she denounced the government's treatment of the Native Americans. She wrote, "There is not among these 300 bands of Indians one which has not suffered cruelly at the hands of either the government or of the white settlers."
Reformers attempted to change Native American culture in order to make them more civilized. They were ordered to give up their religious beliefs and rituals, while Christian missionaries attempted to replace them with their own. In order to alter society through the younger generation, Native American children were assimilated into white society by being educated in white schools. Government sought to move further toward change by dividing reservation land into individual plots through the Dawes Act in 1887. Each Native American received a plot of land. However, the idea of taking up farming offended the beliefs of many Native Americans, while also the land was not suitable for farming. As if being forced to relocate and change their way of life, worse trouble loomed. On April 22, 1889, tens of thousands of homesteaders lined the borders of the Indian Territory. When the clock struck noon, they raced to stake a claim. By sundown, these settlers had staked claims on almost 2 million acres. With more demand for land, Congress created Oklahoma Territory in 1890, available to settlers, and in the following years, the remaining Indian Territory was open to settlers. After half a century, more than 1,000 battles had been fought, over 950 U.S. soldiers and countless Indians had died. The Native Americans had been conquered and their way of life would never be the same. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Westward Movement.